It was First Officer Zyxu's first day aboard the multi-species explorer ship Kepler. As a young Arcturian fresh out of the academy, he was eager to begin his career among the stars. Yet when he arrived at the docking bay, Zyxu couldn't help but hesitate as he watched the human crew members loading equipment onto the ship. Like all Arcturians, Zyxu had been taught that humans were an insane species. While brilliant engineers and fearless explorers, they took risks no sane being would. Their history was filled with tales of reckless adventures, death-defying stunts, and improbable victories against all odds. They seemed to have no concept of a measured response. If faced with a challenge, humans would meet it head-on, regardless of the danger or potential for catastrophe. Must keep your distance from them, lest their madness proves contagious, Zyxu's academy instructor had warned. Thus, it was with no small amount of anxiety that Zyxu approached and introduced himself to the Kepler's captain, Dr. Alice Weber. However, to his surprise, Weber greeted him warmly and set about familiarizing him with the ship. Then over the next few days, as they departed Arcturus and began their 3-month journey to the outer colonies, Zyxu's trepidation faded. He found the human crew friendly, intelligent, and professional. Maybe the academy had them all wrong. The humans he met hardly seemed insane at all. 2 weeks out from Arcturus, Kepler received a distress call from a nearby mining colony. Zyxu was on the bridge when the call came in, a desperate plea for aid. "Please help, our reactor is destabilizing. We'll have a meltdown in a few hours if we can't get the emergency cooling system back online. Please, if there are any ships close enough to us." The message cut off abruptly in a burst of static. Immediately, the bridge descended into tense discussion on whether they could reach the colony in time. Based on their current location and top speed, even if they turned back now, it would be close. Dangerously close. As the crew debated their limited options, Zyxu felt a knot of anxiety twist inside his gut. Surely they wouldn't attempt a rescue when it could very well jeopardize their own lives. Eventually, the captain gave a sharp nod, her face grim. "Helmsman, plot an emergency course for the Sirius mining colony. Let's give him a fighting chance at least." Zyxu flinched, a dozen alarmed protests springing to mind. But the disciplined part of his brain clamped down, acknowledging that Captain Weber outranked him. If she said to race towards potential disaster in a long-shot rescue mission, protocol demanded that he comply. As Kepler spun on its axis and blasted back the way they'd come, Zyxu glanced around at the humans readying equipment or strapping into Crash's seats. To his surprise, most wore an expression mirroring the captain's. Jaws clenched with determination, ready to risk it all for the slim chance of saving strangers. Zyxu shook his head in disbelief. Maybe his people were right after all. These humans truly were insane. 20 nail-biting hours later, with Kepler's engines dangerously close to overheating, they finally arrived at the distressed mining colony. The emergency cooling system for the colony's fusion reactor had completely failed, leaving the engineers unable to control the core temperature as it continued rising toward meltdown. Rapid evacuation was already underway, hampered by frequent solar flares disrupting shuttle launches. The planet side, liquid helium reserves were nearly depleted as well, needed to keep buying them time. Captain Weber quickly coordinated with Kepler's chief engineer, Shah, to lead a small team over to the colony's reactor room in an attempt to manually restart the cooling system. "We'll buy you as much time as we can," Weber informed the lead colony supervisor. "But unless your people can repair the primary system, even restarting the backup won't last forever." Zyxu thought the colony supervisor looked just as anxious and uncertain as he himself felt, but she gave a determined nod all the same. "Anything you can do to keep the core stable as a chance for more colonists to escape, give it your best shot and we'll do the same from our end." What followed were among the tensest hours of Zyxu's life. He found himself glued to the scans of the distressed mining colony almost as desperately as the engineers racing to meet the escalating disaster. In the colony's reactor room, engineer Shah and her team worked tirelessly to bypass failed components and hot wire connections that would trick the backup systems into activating. Meanwhile, the remaining skeleton crew of colonists made dangerous forays toward the core to manually flush emergency liquid helium through the containment shell, despite the rising levels of radiation threatening to cook them alive. It was madness, utter madness, Zyxu thought, both human crews pushing relentlessly onward, refusing to give up even when hope of stabilizing the reactor began to dwindle. Didn't they realize they could still withdraw to safety? Why stay and risk certain death against such impossible odds? Yet through coordination, sacrifice, and sheer determination, somehow in the end they pulled it off. Despite all reasons saying it couldn't be done, 2 hours later alerts showed the core temperature finally leveling out as the patchwork cooling system battled against the meltdown. A ragged cheer went up across Kepler's bridge, where the last stranded colonist had gathered to follow updates. It was immediately followed by warnings blaring that the emergency systems were still extremely fragile. But Captain Weber gave the order for remaining shuttle's dirt side to be granted permission for emergency launches. Kepler and her crew had bought them the precious time they'd gambled so dangerously to scrape together. Now it was up to the survivors' planet side to run like hell before their jury-rigged solution gave out again. In a surge of activity, the last colony shuttles rocketed toward Kepler, docking with barely controlled crashes against the airlocks in their haste. Less than 20 minutes later, the chief engineer radioed from groundside. Final team is clear and returning to the ship. Shuttle prepped for emergency extraction on your mark. Confirmed, Shah. Well done, Weber answered. You and your team deserve a damn medal for pulling that off. She paused as an alarm suddenly began shrieking across the bridge. Scans showed the makeshift cooling system starting to falter. And it looks like your window for extraction is right about now. Burn skyward, Shah. That is an order. Through the external feeds, they watched the last shuttle scream away from the planet's surface mere minutes before the containment shell began to crumble. Melted metal breached the remaining clamps, and the entire assembly erupted in a fiery explosion that consumed half the colony complex. Suddenly stranded with no fuel production or resources left to sustain its inhabitants, Kepler's sensors showed the rest of the colony would be rendered uninhabitable within days. Still, it had done its job. What few colonists remained were safely aboard. As exhaustion finally settled over the crew, Zyxu stared numbly at the disaster they'd narrowly managed to outrun. So many lives still lost, he couldn't help but dwell. They'd cut it so impossibly close to complete destruction themselves, and all for a group of strangers. Where was the logic? Truly, humans were utterly insane, and yet, seeing them greet the rescued with weary smiles or cling to each other in weepingly relief, Zyxu felt his perspective shift. Their determination in the face of overwhelming adversity, their willingness to risk all on even the slenderest chance that just one more soul might be pulled from the fire. Could the same trait spurring such insanities also be the well of profound compassion that drove them to such heroic limits? As Kepler resumed course for their original destination, Zyxu knew without doubt that this crisis would leave its mark. He'd witnessed the incredible stubbornness, courage, and commitment his crewmates displayed in duress peril. Sane or not, it kindled a kernel of respect in Zyxu's heart that he rather suspected would only deepen in the months ahead. Perhaps risking all for the lives of others wasn't as insane as he'd been taught after all. Only time among these endlessly fascinating humans would tell.